Welcome to the Metabolic Classroom. I'm Professor Ben Bikman, biomedical scientist and professor of cell biology. In today's lecture, we are discussing lactate metabolism. Now, I know what you're thinking. When you hear the word lactate, in your mind, you may be immediately thinking of lactic acid. Let's just establish this and clarify it up front. In humans, as in other animals, there is no lactic acid. We're going to talk about the origins of lactate in just a moment and clarify this a little bit. But everything you've ever heard about lactic acid is probably false, including its very existence within the human body. A lot of people have incredible and remarkable even misconceptions. But in normal animal cells, in all sorts of possible conditions, it's lactate. It's in this what's called a salt form. It's not the acid. It's not a lactic acid. And it's not the cause of muscle soreness. It's not the cause of muscle fatigue. The whatever your track coach or your health authority told you as you were growing up and engaging in sports, it's not true. All right. Now that I've dispelled that, let me just state it again very clearly without the rambling. Humans have lactate. We do not have lactic acid. Lactate is a product of what's called anaerobic glycolysis. Now, I personally don't like that term, anaerobic. Anaerobic uh, invites this idea of this phenomenon occurring in the absence of oxygen. Now, there is not a situation in humans where there's no oxygen, and so that doesn't particularly apply. The term that I prefer is non-oxidative glycolysis or even non-mitochondrial glycolysis. Now, let me just give you a very brief primer on glycolysis. This being relevant because it's the origin of lactate. When you have a glucose molecule that has entered a cell, immediately it commits to this path of glycolysis or the splitting or the breaking down of glucose. Everything is in common, what I call the preparatory phase, the payoff phase, and then you get to the end of this and you get to a molecule called pyruvate, not pyruvic acid. It's pyruvate that is produced. Now pyruvate has an option, and generally whichever option predominates is a function of whether there are mitochondria there, because some cells don't have mitochondria. Well, one particular type, which I'll mention in a moment, and then the demand of the ATP. Not so much is there oxygen present. There's always going to be oxygen present. So I don't like to focus on that particular aspect of it. Now, when you get down to pyruvate, glycolysis, now the pyruvate molecule, and thus the end of glycolysis, has two options. It can either go through this non-oxidative or non-mitochondrial final step, or it can go through this final step, which ends up putting it at the beginning of a whole bunch of other steps through oxidative or mitochondrial glycolysis. Let's just stick with that one for just another second. If the pyruvate molecule goes into the mitochondria, it will become acetyl-CoA, and then you have the citrate cycle or Krebs cycle now, and then everything else that comes thereafter, like electron transport, oxidative phosphorylation. However, if you get to the pyruvate molecule, let's go back to the first option, and now it is staying outside the mitochondria, or non-oxidative or non-mitochondrial or anaerobic, again, which I don't love because of the potential confusion. Now the pyruvate goes through an enzyme called lactate dehydrogenase and becomes lactate, the lactate molecule that we know, even if we've been accidentally calling it lactic acid. It's not lactic acid, and it never is in the body. So that's lactate. So lactate, we could say it very succinctly, is the end product of non-oxidative glycolysis. It's a product that comes whenever a tissue or a cell, to be more precise, needs to create a lot of ATP or the chemical energy very, very quickly. Thus, one common source is muscle. Muscle is a common source because not only we have so much muscle, in the average individual, most of the tissue in their body is made of muscle. So muscle is the predominant tissue on the human body, so we have so much of it, but also it has moments of extraordinary demand for energy. In those instances, like for example, high intensity exercise, Lactate is going to be a common product because it is the end product of non-oxidative glycolysis. And non-oxidative glycolysis is a nice way to produce a lot of ATP very quickly.